Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. We're really excited to be starting the workshop here today. Many of you probably know me and know that I've been working to help coordinate the NIMS West Coast region efforts to understand and address the entanglement issue coastwide. I think for those of you who may not know me, you're going to get a pretty good chance to meet me through this workshop. As Jen said, I'll be sort of present in terms of overall MC of the workshop. You'll also see me moderating various sessions and even presenting at times. So I think it's pretty safe to say, no matter what, by the end of this, you will have heard more than enough for me to last you for quite a while. What really excites me about this workshop is the coastwide perspective, that we're bringing together here. At NIMS, we've really been engaged with and in all three states, working on ideas for the development and evaluation of management strategies to address the entanglement risks to ESA listed whale and sea turtles. I think it was through the tri-state coordination that the idea of bringing together a forum like this to bring about the state of the science, particularly with where NIMS science is at, but also much more broad than that and other relevant science as well. That this kind of forum would be the ideal place to bring a lot of stakeholders together at one time, and that this emerged as really a useful, if not necessary, step as we move forward really collectively on a coastwide level. All right, so in terms of the agenda for the workshop, at a high level, hopefully most of you have been aware of what we're going to do, but this is a 5-part virtual series. We'll be together on Tuesday and Thursday of this week and the following week. There will be a slight adjustment next Tuesday. There'll be a shorter 3-hour session in the morning, followed by a 2-hour session in the afternoon that's focused on a particular topic of barriers to gear innovation. We're certainly hoping that you all are able to tune in for all of this, or certainly as much as you're able to. We'll try to work to really build the conversation as we go along, even respecting the fact that folks may not be able to tune in for everything, and that we do have these sort of separate session topics. In terms of the topics that we're going to cover during the workshop, this morning briefly we'll talk about some of the management's perspectives around the entanglement issue as folks are heading into the workshop. There'll be a couple of sessions really focused on understanding the dynamics of marine life from an ecology, a monitoring, and a modeling perspective. We'll have a session that's looking at trying to understand the fishing dynamics here of fixed gear fisheries on the West Coast. There'll be a session on Entanglement Science and what we've been learning from the information we get from entanglement reports and responding to those. There'll be a session that looks at understanding the socioeconomic side of management considerations that are in front of us here on the West Coast. There'll be a session looking to tie a number of these elements and scientific pieces together in terms of how to evaluate different management strategies. As mentioned briefly, there'll also be a session exploring the barriers and the solutions to gear innovation on the West Coast. And for those of you who are able to hang in there with us, at the end, we'll come back together and we'll try to wrap it all up with some closing perspectives. In terms of the sort of fundamental approach of the workshop, the general format for at least most of the sessions we'll have a series of presentations, typically on the order of 10 minutes. And then after the presentations, we'll engage in a panel discussion. Well, in addition to the presenters, we'll bring up additional folks, including managers and other stakeholders, to join in a conversation. Initially, we really did plan for this to be an in-person workshop. I think we started planning for this right at the beginning of the calendar year. So, certainly we've been adjusting, like most everyone has, to the situation in the world ever since. There are some pros to this. Certainly we're glad to be able to really offer probably a much more broad opportunity for folks to tune in than would be with an in-person event. But we also recognize it does limit the ability for a lot of different folks to have input into this conversation as we go. We do welcome Q&A from everyone as we go along. We're really going to be looking for opportunities, to either address questions that you all may have as we go along, or potentially afterwards as part of some individual or even collective follow-up. Certainly not promising we'll be able to get to all the questions that you ask of us, but it'll be something we're trying to work in as we go. There may be some other options for input from the audience, things like polls and like that. Not exactly sure how we're going to use that. This is somewhat of a live work in progress here over the course of the workshop. But ultimately, glad you all are with us. We hope you find the material of the workshop useful. We hope you find it interesting, and hopefully even at times you find it entertaining. So I think today, we're going to start off with some of that big picture perspectives for management as we are beginning the workshop. And then later on this morning, we'll have a session that starts looking into the marine species dynamics and what we're learning about those, and how that information is relevant to the management considerations of how to address the entanglement issue. So I think that's all I've got for now. I guess I'll hand it back over to Paige.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Dan. So we'll move right into our first session, which will provide information on West Coast state management frameworks for entanglement risk. The session objective is to provide a shared frame of reference for the workshop by reviewing the trajectory of entanglement science and management responses, as well as sharing contextual information about each state's progress and approach. In this session, we'll hear from Dan from NOAA Fisheries West Coast Regional Office, who will be providing key framing on the issue of entanglements from NOAA's West Coast-wide and federal perspective. We'll also hear from the 3 West Coast state fishery management agencies, specifically Heather Hall from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, followed by Karin Brady from Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Sankey Mastrop from California Department of Fish and Wildlife. We'll have until about 10:15 a.m. Pacific time for a moderated discussion, including questions and answers, which can be submitted from any participant via the WebEx platform. I'd like to invite Dan to start us off. So back over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Paige. Hi again. Yeah, I'll start us off here with some big picture perspective from the NIMS West Coast region in terms of how science and management intersect. I'm hopeful that most of you tuning in are generally aware of the situation on the West Coast regarding entanglements. For those who aren't, ultimately the graph here on the right-hand side is the underlying reason for why we are here today. The increase in the number of confirmed reported entanglements on the West Coast has been fairly dramatic starting in about 2014. In particular, it's the number of humpback whale entanglement reports and the addition of blue whales, that has really got everyone's attention, primarily because of their ESA listed status. We also note there have been several leatherback sea turtle entanglements on the West Coast as well during these recent years. So certainly with this increased entanglement reporting activity, that's brought about a number of other issues, from the legal and conservation side, but also from the public and industry side in terms of wanting to address this issue. I don't think that really any of us can imagine that the future is a situation that looks like the right-hand side of this graph. And so obviously realizing the need to figure out how to move forward, that's why we're talking today. Specifically from our perspective, our engagement in this issue has primarily come from interest in the science side and really trying to put our arms around this issue and trying to understand exactly what is happening, why has there been so many more entanglements reported lately, what is the cause of all this. And really prior to even this increase in 2014, we had already begun a fairly serious and dedicated engagement into trying to understand this issue ultimately so we could turn around and then to our stakeholders, and particularly, state fisheries. Most of the fixed gear fisheries here on the West Coast are state managed, and we've really been wanting to put ourselves in position to be able to help folks figure out, what can they do in these various fisheries to try and reduce the threat of this problem. So I think maybe in 2007 is when I started working at the West Coast region. I mean, we started right away in terms of, trying to understand these fisheries a lot better. We hit the docks to talk to people, to learn about gear, and so that we were able to better identify the gear that was involved in entanglements. We started working on co-occurrence modeling and things like that, just to try and figure out where might some of these problems be originating from. So we've long been in a scientific quest, if you will, to understand this issue. I think the sum total of that knowledge to date, it really does place this as a coastwide issue from our perspective, and it involves really all fixed gear fisheries. We only really know the origins of about half the confirmed entanglements that are reported to us. So, we do see this as a very broad issue that involves all fixed gear fisheries. I don't think there's any secret or surprise that the Dungeness crab fishery is a fishery that we have more commonly identified associated with entanglements than other fisheries. Just fundamentally from the scope of that fishery, the amount of gear that's deployed in the water, the extent of the coast that gear is deployed over, is most likely the cause for that. But certainly, we look also past the Dungeness crab fishery to all the other fixed gear fisheries, and are interested in working through all of those with all of those fisheries. NIMS has certainly a unique role here, both a dual science and management role. I think our science centers in particular are the home of much of the leading science and research on marine mammals, on the West Coast and around the world. A lot of the information that's fundamental goes into our stock assessment reports, produced by our science centers. So, science is certainly a big part of what NIMS does in the management and conservation of marine mammals and other marine ESA listed species. We certainly have the overarching management role here as well. The Marine Mammal Protection Act and some of the features there, including the list of fisheries, are things that, at least at the West Coast region, we participate in. And the ESA, which is one of the most important issues, and what we're going to be looking to address through the conservation planning efforts that the states are engaged in. So from our perspective, those big, management mandates, they all come from and are based in a science perspective, and we're obligated to use the best available science in these management frameworks. So, this kind of workshop to try and pull together, the best available science is critical to us being able to do our job, in that overarching management role. So the last few years, there's really been a flurry of activity here on the West Coast. There's been working groups convened in all three, West Coast states, looking at the Dungeness crab fisheries and beyond in terms of how to address the entanglement activity. There's been multiple workshops convened, looking specifically at things like forensic science and gear innovation. There's been litigation. There's been changes to the fishing seasons and Dungeness crab fisheries. So, there's been an awful lot going on here in a relative short amount of time. I think really when it sort of boils down to where we're at is, there just doesn't appear to be any really easy answers here, of how to avoid entanglements, without at least some changes to, the way that fixed gear fisheries are being prosecuted here. And, I think at the heart of that is why we need to bring science to the table, because, not only are there no easy changes, it's even difficult to figure out exactly which changes and how we might implement changes to address these things. So at the heart of all this is going to be, the use of science here. Sort of finally here, really just want to recognize that this is quite an ecological dilemma here on the West Coast. I think we're blessed in that we do have uh, quite a few whales here, and there is evidence that there's more whales now here on the West Coast than there has been in the past. Now, that's not to say there's not a lot more complicated issues regarding some of the populations, and all things may not be equal for all. But just knowing that we do have a lot of whales here, this is kind of an ecological dilemma. I don't think the problem is going to go away anytime soon. As long as whales are protected, by these federal laws, as long as people care about whales and are interested in their welfare, I think this issue just isn't going away, and we do need to work to find some solutions here of how to move forward. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving forward, I think science is the way, and certainly from the NIMS perspective, it's a mandate, that we bring all the best available science as we move forward on this issue. There are really, it's almost countless, how many ways to indicate how science could be used to address this issue. I think one in particular helpful way is to look at the conservation plan efforts that all three states are looking at, as a guidepost. I'll take a moment here just to say, the conservation planning and incidental take permitting process under the ESA is a complex thing. How that interacts with the MMPA is very complex, and we just don't have the time and the ability to address all of that in this workshop here. It is, worthy of its own workshop in and of itself. But what I think we can pull out of the conservation plan process is, what there are a lot of good ways that the plan asks us to organize, how we're approaching and managing this issue. And, just out of the conservation plan, I'm able to easily pull out a number of items where, I expect science will play a key role in how these are developed. For starters, just the fundamental design and evaluation of management measures that'll be implemented under these conservation plans. Can't imagine doing that without looking at the best available science, the data, and any scientific tools that we have to help us conduct those evaluations. The use of a dynamic management approach, I think particularly in California, the RAMP program that's been under development, is an example of an effort to try and engage in a dynamic management of the crab fishery. So, and certainly to this point, I think we'll hear a little bit more about that in a moment, but, at its heart is a real thirst for data and information and the best available science to help that process operate fully. We're going to need to monitor, not only the ecosystem and sort of the fundamental interaction between the fisheries and whales, and do we see signs of changes? Do we see signs of even potentially bigger problems on the horizon? But we're also going to be looking to monitor the effectiveness of the measures that are implemented. Are they working? Are they not? What would be potentially better options? We're also going to be needing to look at the impact of those measures, on the fishing community as well. And again, scientific tools are the way we're going to figure that out, and we'll talk about a lot of those during this workshop. Finally, the concept of adaptive management. This is going to be an iterative process. I don't think anyone can expect that tomorrow anyone can unroll a plan that's going to solve the problems and the story will be over and the issue will be done. So, I think we'll be continually featuring a scientific approach towards, trying to learn what have we done that's good, what have we done that needs help. So I think that's, again, where all good examples of the ways that science is going to come into play as we navigate the future here. So with that, I think I will stop.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan. That was really valuable framing. We're going to continue directly to our next presentation, which will be provided by Heather Hall from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Good morning. My presentation starts with an overview of the management structure for coastal Dungeness crab. On the West Coast, the states have management authority from that extends from our state management at 3 miles out to 200 miles under a provision in the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which is unique for state managed fisheries. The 3 states coordinate our crab management issues through the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Management Council and the Tri-State Dungeness Crab Committee. In Washington, our regulations are considered and adopted by the Fish and Wildlife Commission, but the Commission's also given the WDFW director the authority to adopt emergency regulations when they pertain to time, place, and manner. This makes our regulatory process easily responsive to emergent issues. And WDFW also is a co-manager of our fisheries in the area north of Point Chehalis, Washington, which is near Westport and Grays Harbor with 4 treaty tribes. To achieve balanced harvest sharing, our state tribal management agreements rely on season delays and closed areas for the state fishery, resulting in a management structure that is somewhat different than Oregon and California. So beginning in 2017, in response to increased entanglements on the West Coast, in the fall of 2017, the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Management Council hosted the first Washington Whale Entanglement Working Group. And we continued to work with that group and have continued. But in 2018, that group developed a best practices guidelines document that was specific to Washington. In 2019, WDFW held a series of stakeholder meetings to focus the discussion on regulatory changes that we could make to reduce the risk of entanglements in our fisheries. And in the fall of 2019, we took our regulatory proposals to the Fish and Wildlife Commission. And with their approval of that rule package, we implemented several changes specifically targeted at reducing whale entanglement risk, which became effective this year. So one of those rule changes was implementing one of the key best practices recommendations from the Whale Entanglement Working Group, which requires using only the amount of line necessary to compensate for tides, currents, and weather. We recognize that this rule has some enforcement challenges, but it was widely supported by our industry. And we viewed it as having a very strong educational component. And we thought that was really important to spreading the word on entanglement risks and things that fishermen can do to actively reduce those risks. Another rule change included reducing our pot limits by a third beginning May 1 each year, and also on May 1 of each year requiring a summer buoy tag, which is different than the buoy tag that's used from the December through April time period. The summer buoy tag enforces the reduced pot limit, but it also identifies active participants in the fishery from that May 1 period to the end of the season. This change was linked to a legislative change, which was sponsored by our stakeholders to revise our derelict gear program and allows us to expand that gear recovery program to begin earlier in the year while the fishery is underway. And finally, we adopted a line marking requirement that's specific to Washington. So we've had folks testing out some line marking tools, paint, tape, etc., voluntarily, but effective December 1, 2020, fishermen must mark 12 inches of their line using red in at least 2 places, at the top near the buoy and at the bottom near the pot. We see this as a first step in line marking. The current rule language has a lot of flexibility, but we acknowledge we can make changes as we learn more going forward. We also need more coordination and discussion with Oregon and California to ensure that the marking requirement is unique to Washington state fishermen. So there's some work to do there. And then relative to the incidental take permitting process, we began drafting our conservation plan for the coastal Dungeness crab fishery earlier this year. We're seeking coverage for humpback and blue whales and leatherback turtles. Our analysis focuses on the time period between 2013 and 2019, which is really, we view as the most reliable entanglement data and captures the most recent entanglement events. Our progress has involved continual and close coordination with the NIMS West Coast Region Protected Resources Division, where the process is we'll draft a section of that conservation plan, send it to our NIMS folks, and then get together for a discussion and a review and then incorporate those changes. So we're doing sections at a time. We just reviewed section 4 last week, and we're getting prepared to do section 5 in the next few weeks. The conservation plan includes the foundation of those key regulatory changes that we just implemented. And our goal is to have a draft completed by the end of December. Our plan is to have that reviewed internally by WDFW staff, and then to submit that WDFW reviewed draft to NIMS and NOAA by early January 2021. So relative to science and our conservation plan, we have a history of using logbook data in our fishery and a long history of fish ticket data. That information gives us a really good idea of where the fishery occurs off the coast of Washington and how fishing effort changes throughout the season. The management tools we've implemented so far reflect the timing of entanglement records that show more entanglements are reported in the spring and summer. But we also know that that isn't the complete entanglement story. So we're remaining open to more information there. We're building our conservation plan and management tools to be responsive to the presence of whales, but we need more information, and we're excited for the opportunity to have that conversation at this workshop over the next couple of weeks. But we really need information on when whales are likely to be off the Washington coast, and better entanglement data that's closer linked to when and where entanglements occur. And finally, key science needs for Washington, then just focus really on the specifics of Washington. So looking for humpback whale population abundance, including estimates of each of the distinct population segments, understanding the routes of humpback whales and blue whales, migratory paths off of Washington, and understanding which ecological indicators are suitable for predicting entanglement risk in Washington and how to use those to adjust our management approach. We also really need some help with the socioeconomic analysis of the management changes we're making. We don't have an economist at WDFW, so we're hoping we can get some help on that. And then looking ahead, we really want to build a management structure that provides a meaningful fishing opportunity in a way that promotes healthy whale populations. We're striving for zero entanglements, and we note that entanglements are a rare event off Washington, but that makes them really hard to predict. We really want to work with fishermen to help them be innovative with their gear so they can be involved in building a more robust and effective, efficient management toolbox that we can use, particularly in Washington under our regulatory system that allows us to be really responsive with those tools. And finally, we need a way of linking what we know about whale populations and the factors that influence their behaviors so we can be most effective at reducing that entanglement risk. That's it for me.
Thanks so much, Heather. We'll move directly to our next presentation by Karin Braby from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Thanks, Paige, and good morning, everybody. I appreciate the introductory slides and remarks from Dan and Heather, which have framed up a lot of the regional issues and perspectives. And so I'll just jump straight into the Oregon perspective, and I'll take the next slide. Thank you. So this is the Oregon history of entanglements, including an entanglement that occurred this year, recognizing that this year's entanglements are not necessarily over yet. You've seen the pattern of elevated entanglements on the West Coast since 2014. And the scale bar is in the tens of dozens of entanglements across the West Coast. Oregon has a fairly small portion of that problem looking at this specific graph. It's 1 or 2 entanglements that have been observed and confirmed each year. But we have the same pattern of increase in frequency, and particularly concerning increase in frequency of humpback entanglements. And so we look at this as, Oregon is closer to the mark, but we still own a very important portion of the problem that the West Coast is facing. And we, like Washington and California and NIMS, are committed to finding good solutions to this problem, projecting that we think that this type of problem will continue to persist and potentially increase as we see ocean change hit our coast as well. So particularly, I'm just looking at the most recent years, 2014 and to 2020, as being that indication of an elevated problem in Oregon, as well as other locations. Also, I just wanted to note that there is, a really challenging problem for Oregon, and I would pose for Washington as well, in that our coasts have much lower human population centers than much of California, and so there is at least perceived, if not real, issue of having fewer individuals out on the water looking for entanglements in our Pacific Northwest area compared to California. And Oregon gear has been found entangled on whales that have been observed all the way from Mexico through Washington. So it is a broad regional problem for Oregon gear, as well as all 3 state fisheries. Next slide. One more click. So this light blue box is really the driving force behind our management approach. And our vision is that we can align the management of the Oregon Dungeness crab fishery and work with our tri-state partners to the north and south to align management across the region, both to meet conservation goals for whales, but also meet economic goals for the Dungeness crab fishery. And so it's really this concept of coexistence of a vibrant, economically viable fishery, as well as a vibrant and biologically viable whale population across the West Coast. Next slide. So expanding those 4 points in our multi-pronged approach, we have been investing in research and monitoring efforts in collaboration with NIMS, in collaboration with researchers, including Lee Torres and others who will be speaking later in the workshop, including the Oregon Dungeness Crab Commission and industry, to map fishery effort and model whale distribution and fishery effort moving forward. That's been going on for some time now. The last 5 years, we've really stepped up our education and awareness efforts with the fleet in particular, but with the public in general, and recognize all the efforts by Pacific states, the Crab Commission, the Oregon Whale Entanglement Working Group, and others to help meet these goals of defining and raising awareness about the problem. Like Washington, we have state regulations that drive most of our management of Dungeness crab in the state. They are supported by higher level statutes as well, but really the day-to-day regulations for the fishery are in state rule and controlled by our Fish and Wildlife Commission decision making. The fishery has a long history of placing limitations on participants, on gear, on season, and other aspects of the fishery that coincidentally are also very important for managing and mitigating whale entanglement risk. They weren't designed initially for that purpose, but they do help us limit that potential for entanglement. And more recently, in the last decade, we've focused on biotoxin management, which has allowed us to start our season more reliably and keep our season open more consistently during the season, which in turn has us with our fishery activity being focused at the beginning of the season earlier than the bulk of the humpback whale migration to Oregon waters. Specific to whale entanglement risk reduction, we've entered into a two-part phase or two-phase approach. Last year, we finished a package of regulations for our commission on accountability. This year, we are taking a second package next month, specifically on risk reduction. And like Washington and California, we're very much in the middle of the fourth part of our approach in developing a conservation plan to describe our mitigation of the problem and our plans for adaptive measures in the future. Next slide. I want to focus just on the primary measures above, but this slide lists out all of our proposed regulations for our September rules package. But the primary measure is really pot limit reduction as of May 1st. For our recommendation to our commission, it's a 20% reduction of each of the pot tiers, and gear would be excluded outside of 30 fathoms, which is where the primary humpback habitat is. And a season tag would indicate legal and unlegal gear in those areas. This package we are proposing has a sunset date of 3 years or 3 seasons so that we can learn from this initial package and make adjustments as needed. Next slide. I think previewing for conservation plan and adaptive measures, this is a way that we're looking at risk reduction alternatives. And these are not meant to be read in columns, but rather in rows. The top row is looking at our pot tier percentage reduction levels that we've been analyzing. The second row is the date of action of any risk reduction measures in the fishery. And the third is an exclusion line for bathymetry in fathoms. And so we're looking at these series of levels and analyzing each of these levels to give us not only a first step in risk reduction alternatives, which in this slide happens to be the center 3, 20%, May 1st, and 30 fathoms, but really thinking about this as a sliding situation where we can adaptively increase or reduce constraint on the fishery depending on adaptive approach and observations of the problem in the field. But to do that, we need to really have our science information nailed down, and in particular, understanding when whales are in Oregon waters, what their depth distribution is, and what genetic structure breeding population they're coming from, so that we can work strategically to constrain the fishery to decrease that co-occurrence with whales. Secondly, we need to know that the measures we're proposing are effective, and for gear modifications in particular, effective modifications that are also affordable for the fleet is a key objective. Next slide, please. I'm almost done. So a little bit more going back to the West Coast scale, I think overall, just not thinking about specific projects, but overall our science needs are really about providing compelling information that describes the problem and really gives us assurance that management steps we will take in the future will be effective. So that includes both post hoc analysis of what we've done, as well as projecting into the future what we might do, and the assurances that those will be helpful. And with that, I'll just mention that there are a lot of people who have been involved in the effort in Oregon. And I appreciate not only my own staff from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, but industry, NGOs, and a host of folks across the region that have helped us, and appreciate this workshop opportunity and look forward to the remainder of it. So thanks.
Thanks, Karin. That was really informative. Last up, we'll hear from Sonky Mastrup from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Next slide, please. I want to first thank the enormous group of collaborators that have gotten California to where it is now in terms of this issue. We couldn't have done it without all that, and we look forward to continuing that. I wanted to start with mandates driving California's management, because there's multiple ones. It's not just the federal ESA and MMPA, which of course is important. But now, last week, the commission moved leatherback sea turtles to candidate. So we also have California Endangered Species Act mandate, which under candidate allows no take at all. We, of course, have our Fish and Game Code 8276, which created the ramp formally and the mission and mandate to reduce entanglements to the extent practicable. Our Marine Life Management Act also demands that we minimize bycatch, and unfortunately, whales are our biggest bycatch. And then the Ocean Protection Council also adopted a Vision Zero mortality goal policy, which also is directing us to keep these to the minimum. The point here I want to bring across, this is a forever challenge. It's not just about ESA listing. The goal is California does not want whales entangled to the extent we can avoid it. Next slide. We've been pretty busy working on solving this problem over quite a few years now. Collaboratively, this Dungeness Crab Fishing Gear Working Group was formed in 2015 to work on the problem, and much of what you're going to hear today from California is a result of that group's work. One of the key outcomes is we lovingly refer to as the RAMP, which is a Risk Assessment Mitigation Program. We've piloted it 1 year, and last year under a settlement term, we actually operated under a version of it. We currently have a rulemaking in process to implement it by this next season, which is what we're expecting to happen. We also worked on limiting surface gear for our commercial fishery. That was one of the issues the working group decided could easily help reduce entanglement risk, and that was implemented last year. Along with the statute came director's authority to take management action in season. Next slide. Also worked on improving our marking of all our fixed gear fisheries to help determine the source of entanglements. This year, we are close to wrapping up our first full year of our lost and abandoned gear retrieval program, which established retrieval entities up and down the coast to retrieve lost and abandoned gear after the season. It's working very well so far, so we're very encouraged. We have submitted a draft conservation plan for hopefully an incidental take permit for humpback, blue, and leatherback sea turtles. That's currently under review. We also initiated a rulemaking with under the Fish and Game Commission's authority to tighten up our recreational crab fishery to reduce risk of entanglement through that fishery, which is responsible for a few entanglements. And of course, what we really are focused on here in this workshop is both gear and data innovation. And what I mean by that is, can we develop gear that won't catch whales, and can we develop data streams that help us assess risk and how to mitigate for that risk? Next slide, please. The ramp itself, which we hope to go into place formally for this next season, is a process by which the state and scientists and fishermen and everyone else evaluates potential risk of entanglement using actual entanglements and concentration triggers. These triggers are designed to tell us we might have an increasing problem. The idea of ramp is then we assemble our assessment team, evaluate that risk, where it is, and what are the potential management measures that help mitigate that risk. We're using a zonal approach. What you see here is our proposed management zones. We have 6 zones along the coast, plus a special zone 7 just for leatherback sea turtles. We're hoping to scale the response to risk to these levels of zones. The state in our rulemaking will have several levels of actions that can take to mitigate that risk, from anywhere from a simple advisory to steer clear of an area, to season delay, zonal closures, depth and gear reductions, and requiring of, for example, ropeless gear. Next slide. So science is a key part of the program. As mentioned earlier, though, it's based on, we use what's best available. We're not in the luxury of waiting for it. We'll work with what we have. Some of the key areas that we are trying to use and look forward to this workshop to help improve those is, of course, the distribution of our whales and leatherback turtles, and hopefully some distribution habitat modeling that can come from that to help predict those things. Of course, we still don't really understand well the whole dynamic of how these animals are actually getting entangled. Certainly lots of ideas and logic out there, but we still don't really understand that dynamic very well. We also want to better understand the environmental influences that cause these entanglements to rise, both the whale behavior and the fishing behavior. And of course, as mentioned earlier by, I think it was Washington or Oregon, we also need better information on the socioeconomic dynamics of management. And what we mean by that is, what are the impacts to the various sectors of the fleet to any proposed or implemented management action. Our priorities for science is that it supports the ramp, and just as important is the ramp supports the science. As you know, these are challenging times for science right now, and we look forward to making sure that when we use it, it's supported. We're also looking to, hopefully, science to refining the ramp framework and inform the ITP process. And of course, it's not just about Dungeness crab. We're going to be ultimately looking at reducing entanglements on all our state managed fisheries. Next slide. And I'm here for any